Bruegel to these two panel events on the topic of robots and artificial intelligence, the next frontier for employment and EU economic policy. I'm Paola Maniga, and I'm head of development at Bruegel. I'm very delighted to chair this first session where we will try to give some answer to a very controversial and topical issue, which is what will be the impact of industrial robots on the employment and wages in Europe. So I'm joined today by four great speakers. So starting from Georgios Petropoulos is a research fellow at Bruegel, and his research is focused a lot on the topic of the impact of digital economy, artificial intelligence and big data on the economy. And today he will present, he will launch his paper, which is specific on this topic on the impact of robots on employment and wages in Europe. I think you have found some copies outside. However, we will publish the publication this afternoon on the website. So welcome. Then we will have three commentators. On my right, Julia Bock-Schapelwein. Welcome. Julia is senior researcher at the Austrian Institute of Economic Research, and you have worked a lot on topics related to digitalization, gender, and labor markets. On my left, Anna Biovskaya, Senior Policy Advisor to the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD, where you cover topics related to innovation, technology policy, the digital economy, and the future of work. And then on my far left, Lucas Temiziotis, Head of Unit in DG Employment for the Directorate General Employment and Social Affairs and Inclusion. Welcome. Well, there is no need to introduce this topic. There is certainly no consensus at all on whether robots will have a positive or negative effect on employment and wages globally and in Europe. Let me just mention that I've recently attended the Web Summit in Lisbon, one of the biggest tech conferences in Europe. And at some point I was, together with other 60,000 people, I was in front of a stage where two humanoids, robots, literally took off the stage. And in front of a crowd, let's say half amazed, half terrified, one of them, Sophia, together with Einstein, said, "We robots have no desire to destroy things, but we'll take away your jobs. And it will be a good thing, because working is a drug anyway." So I think I'll stop here, because we really look forward to hear what Georgios has to say on the impact of robots on wages and employments in Europe. You will have 20 minutes to present your paper. And then each of the other speakers will have 10 minutes to comment. So, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paula. I prefer to stand if you don't mind. So, this is a co-authored work with Francesco Chiacco and David Pichler, who are quite shy, so they are sitting in the back. The starting point is some literature that has pointed out to the threat of technological unemployment. The threat of technological unemployment was firstly postulated by Keynes, so it dates quite back. Production processes have become increasingly automated, and the risk, the fear is that workers will be replaced by machines, as the robot at that event that Paula mentioned claimed. The question that we have in our mind is how we can estimate the impact of automation. And in the past years, recent past years, we have seen the emergence of one branch of literature that answers the question how feasible it is to automate existing jobs given current or presumed technological advances. The widely quoted paper by Frey and Osborne predict 47% of US workers that are at risk because of automation. Then we have the European analog by Bowles, published here at Bruegel, that using the same methodology finds that 54% of European jobs are at risk. We have some study by McKinsey that it is more or less at the same level, and in fact, it can be the case that if the technology advances even in a higher rate than today, that number is even higher. However, the Arts, Gregory, and Zierhans from Aheim point out that, we need to look at specific tasks, and we need to see what happened on the specific tasks to be automated. And in fact, within the same occupations, many workers can specialize in tasks that cannot be automated easily. And following this approach, they find that the effect is only 9% of jobs that they are at risk. However, this branch of literature focusing on the displacement effect. What we expect and what happened even in the past is that new machines, AI, new systems, new technologies brought also productivity gains. And in theory, that is illustrated by the new paper by Acemoglu and Restrepo that it is forthcoming in American Economic Review, which basically predicts two effects of automation. The one is the displacement effect. Robots will steal the job of people, but there is also the productivity effect. Since these new automated technologies will bring some efficiencies, that can lead to productivity gains that will expand, increase the demand for labor, and so that people will work with these automated systems in a good way, and we can have a positive impact of technological progress. And this productivity gains is not captured by the first branch of literature I mentioned in the previous slide. And this is not something new. For example, the introduction of automobiles made horse-related jobs to vanish. If we had run this risk of replacement back then, before the introduction of automobiles, we would have captured probably the negative impact will have to job-related, to horse-related jobs. But what about the productivity gains it introduced? We had new industries, new opportunities for employment, not only in the automobile sector, but also in sectors related to that. Construction of roads, new shops in malls during in the big roads between two different cities. So the outcome of automation can be either positive or negative. So what we do here is we move away from this feasibility test. What is it is possible to be automated is at risk. And we follow the approach by Acemoglu and Restrepo, the general equilibrium approach that also controls for the behavior of firms, how firms will react on automation, whether they will invest in automation, whether they will accept these technologies, what will be the market outputs. So Acemoglu and Restrepo develop a theoretical model on that, and then they test it empirically. And we focus on the empirical exercise. Acemoglu and Restrepo AR hereafter focuses on US. We follow a similar methodology with the data available in Europe for European markets. And we focus on 6 countries, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Sweden, that basically represent the more than 85.5% of Europe's robot market. And we estimate the impact of the introduction of robots between 1995 and 2007 on employment and wages. Another element of the study is that focuses a local market approach. In our case, then, we have 116 regions in these countries. And in this way, can exploit the heterogeneity of local labor distributions, but also the country's changes in the use of robots. And also, it can better control for demographic and compositional effects and derive some predictions for different demographic groups and the impact that robots have. So the question that we ask is whether the displacement or the productivity effects dominates. And what we find is that the displacement effect dominates. One additional robot per 1,000 workers reduces the employment rate by 0.16, 0.20 percentage points. However, the impact is less severe than the finding of the American study. It's almost a half. We find that young and middle-educated people are mostly affected. We find also that if we consider ICT as an alternative measure to capture automated technologies, then the impact of ICT on employment is positive. And that probably suggests that we need not only to look at one automated technology like robots, but we need to dig deeper on the different categories of automated technologies in order to be able to estimate the overall impact that automation can have on employment. We don't find a significant impact on robots on wages, and this result is something that motivates us to do further research on this. So let's start with the definition of industrial robots. So it is basically there are three characteristics of these robots that they are introduced in industries. The first one is that they are automatically controlled. It is not necessary to have a human operator. The second is that they can be reprogrammed. And the third is that can perform multiple tasks. For example, in industries we have such robots introduced for packaging services, for yielding, and different such activities. And of course, as I said, there are other, it's just one automated technology. There are others that they are not included in this definition. However, it is an automated technology that we have access to data internationally, so that can facilitate comparison between different regions. And it is something that we haven't seen being studied so much in Europe. There is one study that focuses only in Germany. We try to extend the application of industrial robots as an automated technology following the AR approach for more countries in Europe to get a broader perspective of what is the impact on European market. So, and if we see the data in robots, we see that Europe is a front runner. This graph depicts the robots density, robots per thousand of workers at different parts of the world. And what we see is that Europe is constantly the front runner here. However, in the latest years, we see that the Chinese exposure to robots increases in a high rate and basically drives all the Asian markets in the trends of how many industrial robots are introduced. We don't have micro data on demand supply factors on robots. What we have is some average indices on quality and prices. And what we see is that if we consider as a point of reference the year 1990, we see that prices of robots that introduced in industries have fallen considerably. If we don't take into account the quality effects, the price between 2007 and 90 fall by more than 50%. At the same time, quality has increased. So today, the robots it's approaching 3 times the quality they had in 1990. And how it is defined, quality is a robot's production cost markup. We don't have data beyond 2007, so unfortunately, so this is the latest available information, you can have that. But the main, let's say, conclusion is that robots become more capable and become cheaper. So it can be easier to be considered as a threat for employment. And the main measure, we follow a regional approach, as I said. And what we do is we define, we study the impact of employment and of robots on employment and wages at the regional level by defining a robot exposure index and the change of this index between 2007 and 95. I'm not going to stay in the details because of limited time, paper will be out soon. Please go through it. It's a similar approach like in the AR paper. And the specification we run is it's in regional level at each region R, using demographic group G, and we have 3 dimensions of demographic groups. It's the gender, it is the age, and it is also the level of education. And what we do is we try to estimate the impact in the change of the exposure of robots in a particular region between 2007 and 95 on the change of the employment rate, which is defined as employment divided by working population or total population. We use different measures. And then we see what is this impact. So we estimate this impact. And similar approach we follow for wages. And to be consistent with other studies and the main findings they derive, we introduce a group of controls that are related to measures that could have an impact and probably affect the impact of robots. Exposure to Chinese and US imports, share of manufacturing exposure, extent of routine jobs in the region, offshoring, ICT capital that we will discuss analytically if we have time, and a dummy for the countries that they are north in our sample and the south. Data comes from the European Union Labour Force Survey on employment, and on wages from the European Community Household Panel and the European Union Statistics. And for industrial robots, as you may have seen in the source of the graphs, we use the International Federation of Robotics dataset, which is the available dataset, a point of reference to study the impact of robots. Of course, there may be potential issues of heterogeneity here, in the sense that we try to estimate the impact of robots on employment, but there may be some unobserved trends that might affect both variables, and therefore does not allow us to estimate it in a robust way, or changes, or the possibility that changes on employment and wages has an impact to robots, reverse causality. So what we do is we introduce some instrumental variables that in our regression seem to work really well. Basically, we capture the trend in sector adoption of robots in similar advanced economies that there is data available for this time of the interest in our study. And the best candidates in our sample was United Kingdom and Denmark. However, we use also some employment contracts, which basically is a proxy of the rigidity of the labor contract, which could have an impact, which could define to what extent we could have this reverse causality effect takes place. And we use the employment protection legislation, which is collected from OECD database, either the 99 level, which is before we study estimating the impact, or the change between 85 to 2007, in order also to account the changes in labor policies over this period. So what we find is a consistent negative and statistically significant impact of exposure of robots on employment rate. We focus for heterogeneity reasons in reporting the results on the two IV approaches we follow, which is different combination of the two instruments, the EPL, the labor protection contracts, and the exposure of robots in UK and Denmark. And we find negative significant impact, which is almost half of the impact in US that found by AR study. And in fact, what we do is we used ICT capital as a control. In an analogous way, we define the ICT capital exposure in a regional level. And basically, we rerun the specification by having a second point of interest, a second variable of interest, and either including the robots or not, we get a persistent positive effect of ICT capital on employment rate, which suggests that it is not only robots, there are also some other technologies there that can have a positive impact and contribute to the productivity effect. If we go to specific groups, the results by age show that these bars is the confidence interval, 90%, and we find a significant impact on negative impact on people aged between 15 and 24. So young people that they are ready to enter the labor force are mostly affected by the introduction of robots. On the education group, we see that the middle-educated people in our sample, middle-educated person means someone that had finished high school, and it is between a high school level and a university degree, has a modest but negative significant impact. And men are more affected than women. That probably has to do also with the distribution of the jobs that men are doing and the qualitative differences on the jobs that women are exposed to. Here we see, we go to a sectoral approach, and what we see is that what we estimate here is what is the impact of industrial robots that they have been introduced in mining, manufacturing, and utilities. And this is a total economy, which is basically the regression I showed you before. And we see that, in fact, the significant negative impact comes exactly from these robots that belong to these sectors. This should not be a surprise, as in our data set, the 99% of robots have been introduced in the manufacturing sector. However, moving away to other sectors, we don't find significant impact in the most of them. We only found significant, modest negative impact in wholesale and retail. But there is also another interesting decomposition here. To try to look at different occupations and how they have been affected by the introduction of robots. And here we see that while we have the biggest negative effect comes for plant and machine operators and assemblers, which is something we expect, we see that there is a big positive impact on technicians and associate professionals. So probably this could be a way to explain our more modest effect than the AR study. So there is some productivity gains in this particular area of occupations, but the negative effect is more prevalent. Interestingly, we find a significant negative effect also for legislators, senior officials, and managers that someone could expect for this particular time span will not be the case. Moving on wages, as I said, we don't have a significant result. We couldn't find. This is something we want to explore further. So this is the estimation process. The picture of this non-robust significant impact is quite different by looking only in the correlations, where we see that we have a negative correlation between the change in exposure of robots between 1995 and 2007 and change in employment rate for the same period. And the correlation is more negative in the case of the total economy than in the case of the industry. So the manufacturing, mining, and utilities, despite the fact that have introduced a lot of robots, the correlation in wages is not so steep as for the total economy. However, this is just correlations. It is not an estimated impact that could allow us to be more confident about the estimated result and which of the two effects dominate. Concluding, I have already discussed this a little bit. So the question is, what is the reason of the difference with AR? It is labor market policies, is welfare system. I discussed with one of the panelists before we start, and she was more skeptical about this, so happy to have her thoughts on board. The impact of robots and ICT is something that we want to explore and further and see whether we can have a clearer and deeper understanding on what automated technologies can have a positive or negative impact. There is a German study, as I said, it's to our knowledge, is the only study that focuses on a European member state. And in this study, we don't have a significant impact of robots on employment. And the argument is that manufacturing, there is a negative impact of manufacturing jobs, but there is a spillover effect. People move to other sectors than manufacturing. We didn't report, we couldn't find this spillover effect here. Probably that explains why our result in these 6 countries sample is negative, while they have a neutral impact in the result. And I guess the next step is we have stopped in 2007. Since 2007, a lot of things happened. We stopped because we had some difficulty with data that we try to solve. But the next natural step for us is to move to 2015 and see to what extent results remain or change. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Georgios, for this very interesting presentation. So basically, to sum up your finding, your analysis point out to a significant displacement effect of robots on employment in 6 countries in Europe. The advanced country, which represent, if I remember correctly, about 84% of the concentration of robots in the EU, with a stronger effect on young people and middle education people, but also with effect on several occupations, including, careful here, legislators, senior officials, and managers. So, at the same time, you don't find, your analysis doesn't find a strong impact of robots on wages, but of course, further analysis is necessary. So I start with Julia. It would be great if you give us some comments to Georgios' paper. And maybe you can also let us know how your research coincides or not coincides with Georgios' results. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to this event. I would like to refer my comments to the results, to the numbers you presented, that 1 additional robot per 1,000 workers reduces employment rate by 0.16 to 0.2 percentage points. At the first glance, I was a little bit surprised by the findings compared to the findings from Acemoglu and Restrepo. They have similar lower bounds, 0.16 to 0.118. And I would like to explain why I was surprised, and I would like to give you some examples. The first example is that you have GDP growth rates comparably very higher in the US than in Germany, France, or Italy in this time period, 1995 to 2007. Additionally, keep in mind that in the late 1990s and until the early 2000s, Germany was often called the sick man of Europe. It was Germany has a recession in 2003. Unemployment rate was rising from about 9% to 11% in the mid-2000s. So there are, first of all, you have differences in the GDP. Second, you also have higher robot penetration in the EU than in the US. You have, thirdly, you have differences in the employment rates. That is the employment population ratios based on the population 15 plus. You have higher employment rates of this population age group 15 plus in the US than in the European countries for the whole period 1995 to 2007. You have, on the other hand, you have increasing employment rates in the EU countries, and on the other hand, whereas the employment rate in the US was stagnated in this period. So there you also have, on one hand side, you have difference in GDP growth, you have differences in employment rate and in the structure and in the growth rates. You have, focusing on employment, you have higher employment growth rates in the US than in Sweden, Italy, and Germany in this time period. Third point, it's you have differences in GDP, you have different employment rates, you have differences in employment growth. And fourth, you also have differences in the manufacturing employment. That is, that the employment shares in manufacturing are comparably higher in the EU countries than in the US. And you have somewhat higher employment losses in manufacturing in the US than in Germany in this time period, based on ILO data. So you have a lot of differences that doesn't fit in this picture, but at a second glance, I was no longer surprised. And why? When you take this couple of EU countries as a group, as an average, that is Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Sweden, the difference to the US is becoming smaller. And so, for my opinion, I think that your results fit in this picture. So I would like to close to say that, for my opinion, I think your results are fitting quite well. So.
Thank you, Julia. Anna, maybe you want to bring also the trade union perspective to the debate, and do you have any comments on Georgios Petropoulos?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. No, thank you for the opportunity to comment on an excellent paper, actually. I'm glad that Robert Sophia is not here today, because I tend to profoundly disagree with what she tends to say at conferences. And that's why we need papers like this who have a quite clear focus. And what I found useful in your paper is that you provide from the onset a good literature overview of what's being done in other organizations by other academic institutions, because there you can see why your paper complements those findings. And I think going also further away from your paper, and I come to that, it's important then to see what else needs to be looked at. What other complementary factors do we need to consider in order to then provide tailored solutions in policymaking, to be able to really see what sectors, what industries, what types of tasks, what kind of employment patterns will really change from the deployment of industrial robots and beyond. So therefore your local labor market approach is very good. Also from a trade union perspective, since you asked about that, we are glad that you look at the wage levels as well. Now you don't have a significant result there, which is to a certain extent reassuring. Then again, if you look at other factors affecting wages right now in Europe and beyond, there are other factors contributing to either growth, or we rather observe a wage stagnation, to be honest. So there are other factors to consider, and this is maybe why you only have a suggestive result there. Now, what I find a very useful result in your paper is the fact that you say that some of the professions, of the occupations in the manufacturing sector, are neutralizing each other out in the net effect. And I think that's an important finding, because I would rather then go and really look at the different occupations when I then look at solutions, be it policy, be it in collective bargaining, or whatever solutions there might be. So I think this is a very crucial result here, to say on the sector level we might see a neutral, almost neutral net effect, but we see across occupations major difference that are clearly explicable at the same time. And I also appreciated that you look at offshore ability, that you look at demographics, and that you look at regions, as I've already said, because that gives us, again, a granular view on what could be done. Now, to complement, which maybe is not as reflected in the paper, I feel like we can also look at leading economies when it comes to the deployment of industrial robotics, such as Japan and Korea, to look at empirical evidence there, and also look at the lessons that can be found in those systems, although they are very different in terms of labor market conditions and macroeconomic policy conditions from Europe, but still there are some lessons in it, especially in terms of organizational capital, how it changes. Because I think that's the point that you don't have in your paper, the organizational view about the introduction of technologies, but this is an important one to consider as well. Now, you mentioned yourself that there are new figures on the robot density from 2016. So I feel like taking those figures now and look at them more closely would be an important step forward. Also, what we observe and what we see in our membership is that industrial robots obviously, and that's not a criticism towards your paper, but obviously also affect other sectors. So for instance, we see that right now 750,000 of surgical interventions were performed by robots. So that's a completely other sector, but this is an important one. So in a sense, going forward, it's also important to move beyond, not move beyond manufacturing, but include a sector-wide perspective on that. But then I'm going to retract from that proposal a little bit, because when you look at robot use, it is also important to actually look at industries, which is a bit different concept, to me at least, than sectors, in terms of that there you can see that the share of the introduction of robots is the highest in transport and electronic equipment. So you could also go that road in a complementary way to the sector approach, and then have an even more detailed picture to a certain extent. And obviously also look at firm size, because SMEs are lagging behind, and that's an important, especially in manufacturing, and are losing ground, and from our perspective, are a job creation engine. So it's important to look at that as well. Also look at the context, maybe in terms of employment in manufacturing has been overall declining anyway, also for other reasons than automation. But at the same time, what I wanted to point out is there is also job creation potential. So many papers like yours, and you're mentioning it, but you're not having that many figures on it. But most of the papers you just mentioned, they look at displacement potential and automation potential. They rarely look at job creation potential. And that's, for me, a point where we should look forward and see where are the new jobs coming from. And in a sense, yes, technicians in manufacturing, certainly, that's a takeaway for me then in terms of job creation potential. But moving beyond that, it's also useful to look at that. The impact of different technologies, you've already mentioned that's a next step that you would like to take. And here especially, I feel like you're using 2007 data. And when we look at the emergence of new digital ecosystems and the convergence between different digital technologies, but also with nanotechnologies, biotechnologies, etc., I strongly assume that the effect since 2007 of technological convergence is much greater and of digital ecosystems. And another measure that I'm not sure you're having, because you look at ICT impact, and that's more a question than, I guess, for the follow-up. Are you considering that as digital intensity in a sector? Because you can also, there are measures also by the OECD on digital intensity of a sector, and there, for instance, agriculture is at the bottom. Yet, of course, your findings on industrial robotics are that they are one of the sectors most affected. And investment and costs is something that we care about, and you mentioned that cost is a factor leading to the deployment of robotics. Now, investments are equally important because we want to know who invests, where, and why. And then we can see industry patterns better, we can see competition patterns better as well, and by doing so, we can also then look at the labor market and job effects. So since you've also asked me, and the last point are timescales, certainly. Because industrial robotics, I feel like, is and that's why this paper is important, is something that is already there. And the time scale is more narrow. But when you go to AI, and you mentioned that the impact of AI is 3,000 times higher than other technologies, there you have to be careful with the time scale. The PwC research recently had 3 waves of automation, where they're a little more careful about it. And also from our perspective, it's also a choice. And when you're talking about AI, you also talk about big data, you talk about non-physical systems, etc. So it's much broader than industrial robotics, and you can't really relate it to. No, you can relate it to each other, but from another point of view. So in terms of, from a trade union perspective, and I'll be brief, in terms of the solutions that you suggest in your conclusions, and pitting them against, let's say, the solutions proposed by the labor movement right as of now. They are not necessarily contradictory. What we always advocate for is a just transition approach coming from the COP21 agreement on climate, because we think that this is a comparable issue, a comparable transition. A just transition framework, and you mentioned transition in your paper, involves for us funds, the setup of national funds to enable workers to move from one job to another, but for us, to a job of a comparable or better quality. In that sense, I have to always underline that. The anticipation of occupational tasks changes, so this is what you're doing, so this is a good thing, and strong social protection systems, certainly social dialogue anyway, but that I certainly don't need to say as a trade union representative. Now, as one of our solutions, though, in terms of transitions, we see that sector councils work well. And that corresponds to the fact that you're looking at sectors. Sector councils for overview changes. And there are existing systems in precisely the European labor market. And that's why I'm not surprised that it works better than the US labor market, apart from the fact that the economies are different and the numbers are different. There are certain mechanisms that precisely cushion the impacts of displacements. And these systems are important. You have the Swedish employment security councils, for example, that help workers to find another job in a similar industry, that are co-led by social partners that are under strong employment protection legislation and collective bargaining agreements, and they work well. And you also see with employment protection legislation, even the OECD admits now that it is helping innovation. It does help the accumulation of tacit knowledge at firm level. So it has a positive effect, in a sense, to have stable job conditions. And they don't prevent innovation as such. And social dialogue collective agreements, be very short. We can see now that many of our members are moving ahead. There are agreements on data protection, which is a bit related. There are global agreements. There is now a global agreement on e-commerce. There are many agreements in the automotive sector on the introduction of robotics. There is now also the IG Metall agreement in Germany on reduced working time, which very much relates to the reduction in routine heavy tasks. And so what I wondered in your conclusion, where you say, not in your conclusion, but one of the things you mentioned in your paper, there is not any negative significant impact of robots on employment in Germany, for example. I was then the generalist that I am, I was very generic and then saying, but why is that? Maybe because there are social partners steering the technological deployment. Maybe that's one part of the reasons, but also active labor market policies, a strong social protection system that is inclusive, and so on and so forth. So let me end here because I've been very long, but just to say that when we then proceed forward and look at job creation, from our perspective, it is then important to see what kind of jobs are being created, what is the quality of them, especially when it comes to this increased service content in manufacturing, the increased jobs in the service sector. When you have 45,000 robots working for Amazon, this is a great number, but when you look at the working conditions in their warehouses, those are less impressive. So let me stop here, but for us, the main issue is then job quality and transitions to new jobs.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna, for this very detailed analysis of Georgios' results, and also for already discussing some potentially responses to, to how to ensure sustainable transitions of occupations, of job and tasks. So, Lucas, the floor is yours. It would be great if you also, given your role in the European Commission, you also mention, you start mentioning which responses in education policy and training the European Commission is aiming to give. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Actually, first I would like to welcome your paper because it's really something we were waiting for. The translation, if I may say, or application of the methodology of Acemoglu here in European countries. with our specificities, which are different from the US ones. We'll come back to that. So it is really very welcome. Second, your paper is very topical, on a very structural issue, actually, on a very important structural issue. Very topical. Why? I mean, everybody's working on that now. There are a number of conferences forthcoming. The ILO is preparing a conference next year, the OECD also later this year, I think, the Austrian presidency also soon. We are preparing our new Employment and Social Development report for July. So we are actively working on that, and so we are very happy to have your results and to check against our own work which is underway. So that's very good. I can tell you that we are also working on these two effects, displacement effect, productivity effect. We analyzed that 2 years ago in the Employment and Social Development report of 2016. And broadly, we found a positive, although weak effect correlation between ICT investment and share and productivity. And we found also a positive, although weak correlation between ICT investment and employment. So this is in line with your findings. In this year's report, we have a broader approach. We also have estimations of the effect of introduction of robots with most recent data. And there I would like to point to 3 of our findings. First, on the relation between capital and labor, we clearly see in most of the sectors a continuous capital deepening. That's one thing. Second, the fact that labor can also replace labor. So more better educated people will replace less educated people. Better training, better job matching, etc., plays a role there to replace other labor. And then, and probably most important in this reasoning, is that capital can also be complementary to labor. And this complementarity between capital and skills means that better qualified workers, the higher the probability of capital investment will create new jobs. And this comes to support what Anna was saying earlier on. So I will not go into our results. I come now to your paper, which we find very good, very robust methodology. The estimated equations are derived from a solid theoretical model. The hypotheses are very clearly explained, and the identification strategy is very convincing. So all that's very good. Now, if we come to the Acemoglu methodology, we can see that they are working, they have good local estimates, but based on another concept. They are based on the concept of commuting zones. So in your paper, you have used local data, regional data, which I think is a plus, is a strength. Impact first in general, because we can have a broader view of what's going on, but also it's a plus to the extent that we have no problem to relate to national data. So it's much broader. So I think this is a definite strength of your paper. Then I had another comment on the national effects, which seem to be relatively small compared to other benchmarks. And I have a reference of the paper of Michel and Bivens, where they saw that job losses from the China effect, the China trade source, shock, offshoring, etc., is roughly 4 times as large as the estimated job losses from robot adoption in the US. So I was wondering if you would reach similar conclusions if you use your control variables notably routinization, offshoring, exposure to China, etc. That would be very interesting in the perspective of what I was saying before, the relation of the results with Acemoglu. Then I had another question. To which extent your sectoral results are consistent with observed trends in employment, the observed ones? Because in particular in the manufacturing sector, your results are a bit counterintuitive. We had expected that displacement effect would be stronger there. And we know that we have other studies like Douth and Ali and like Metra and Martek, which study the German automotive sector, and there they have a net effect of 37,000 workers, although 20 to 30% of employees in 2011 are estimated to be dependent directly on robots. So there is something that we should think about, because there are jobs that probably would not exist without robots. So this is related to the job creation, actually, effect. Then, if I stay to this same study, Douth and Ali of last year, you make an assumption that distribution of robots within the industry is proportional to the regional employment in the industry. Okay, that's a bit strong assumption. Of course, I understand that it's difficult for you to have another assumption because this is very direct and practical. However, we could envisage other possibilities like check robustness of your estimations with a number of technicians, for example, by sector. That you say in your paper that technicians are a possible explanation for the manufacturing sector. So maybe there you could control for this factor. Right, and last but not least is the fact that something that was already mentioned by Julia and Anna, the data. Obviously, your data are from 95 to 2007. Well, we know that things go very quickly in this field. We know that you also showed that robots are becoming more widespread and more intelligent and cheaper. And we know that more and more sectors are increasingly applying robots in their production or in the consumption, etc. So, we wonder to which extent these findings can predict the future. But I mean, this is a constant fight, I know. Still, I had to make this comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucas. So maybe, Georgios, do you want to reply to these comments?
Yes. First of all, thanks a lot. They were all very, very helpful and very to the point comments, either on potential explanations of the differences between EU-US, or by bringing some policy perspectives that could be more related with these findings, or by some assumptions and modeling choices that were followed in this paper. So I'm very thankful for that, and for sure it will be very useful. I will start with the point that you all mentioned, that this study so far stops at 2007. And the difficulty you had there was that the industry classification changes before and after 2007. So at the same time, the AR study that focuses on US stopped also at 2007. So what we considered as a first step was to focus on this period and see whether what we observe in Europe and whether there are some changes from the output, the research output that refers to US, and using that as a motivating factor for both further empirical analysis, but also for policy analysis, following the principle first to derive some results, and then we think about them. So that was a difficulty, the technical difficulty to move further. And for sure is something that we are investigating, and we wish to move towards more SNDRs, as I mentioned, in order to see how also this impact will change by considering more SN data and developments. Now, on going back to Julia and starting from her surprise, which in the end was not so big surprise, and I'm glad for that. I think that I think I'm very thankful for the insights you brought on the particular differences between US and EU, that they are macroeconomic differences that go beyond labor market policies, welfare systems. That was basically one way that we are exploring on potentially explaining the different results. And I believe indeed that makes sense that to use also some macroeconomic variables and trends to see whether the results are different. And as you mentioned, we are talking about 6 particular countries in the EU, not all the EU, and that changes a little bit the story. So I think on the point of extending the data for Asian markets that Anna mentioned, like Japan and Korea, indeed the problem is finding data on employment. We have data on robots on that. And find data on employment in the local level in order to be able to find this, to expand this approach to other economies. There are some studies like the Greitz and Michaels that focus on industry country pairs, and they include more countries. And if we go to industry level, we have that there is some more available data, but the problem, I mean, what we wanted was to exploit this regional approach that could be insightful in terms of local markets. In terms of general trends, we see that the robots intensity, density in Japan is not so much increasing as in China. This is what the trends show. So that by itself is something that we would be also very interested to explore, whether they reach a peak and then after that the robots penetration didn't go so fast. In Korea, to be honest, we didn't have any robots data that we analyze, and I cannot comment further on that. On the spillover effects of other sectors, I agree that it is something that we could look further and deeper, probably at the same time that we extend the data set to 2015. The explanation that we have so far for the sectoral results, and that relates also to Lucas' comments, is indeed that occupationally we find opposite impact, significant impact in some categories. And we are, I think it's something that we should further investigate and also investigate the trends as we move forward, what happens. An obvious challenge, the crisis that affected all these economies. Julia mentioned also some smaller scale crises like in Germany or the boost in Spain. This is something also that we should control, but extending the data will also allow us to run some probably time effects between different time periods within the sample. By going to 2015, for example, we could have split the sample to 2-3 periods and have also time effects there, so it's something that we are investigating. On organizational effects that Anna mentioned, I think it's something very interesting to look. So far, we didn't find the angle and the relevant data to do that. So any comments on data sources will be very appreciated. And I think probably, yes, for the sector and controlling for digital intensity, we use the ICT as a control so far. However, indeed, we could, as a robustness check, move to that direction and consider some other measures that they are available there on a sectoral level, not local, right? Unfortunately, you don't have more information on demand and supply to go to who invests, what are the firms they invest, how big they are, how small they are, how SMEs are affected. At the current state, with this type of data, we don't have the information to do that. But we consider the avenue of ICT as a first way to dig deeper and see whether we can find particular indices for big data, for other machine learning, for other technologies, in order to be able to capture more specific automated, the impact of other automated technologies. Let me see. I think, Lucas, I take your comments and let me just respond on two of the points you mentioned. The one is for the German study, which does not find any significant impact overall, but finds a significant negative impact on the manufacturing sector and positive significant impact on the other sectors. We are also surprised by this result. And we try many different specifications, many different regressions in order to see why this is the case. Controlling for ICT in the regression, we see that this kills any significant negative impact in manufacturing. And I know that the German study also controlled for ICT. It's one of the variables, but in our case, it's something that we found. So, and we try to explore by looking at the different occupations, and finding this positive impact on technicians probably is the way. Clearly, we don't find the spillover effect that this study finds, so no significant impact on other sectors. So clearly, the fact that the manufacturing does not have such a big negative impact is a best candidate for explaining the smaller result we have in comparison to US. On the assumption of the local distribution, it's a technical assumption indeed in order to be able to bring the robots data in the local level. It was basically introduced as a first way and inherited by the Acemoglu and Restrepo study in order to be close in comparison of results. But I welcome your comments for further robustness checks on that.
Okay, thank you, Georgios. Let me just ask before I open the floor, I see that your analysis also looks at the gender dimension, and your finding points out to a more negative effects on males rather than females. I remember that the World Economic Forum results actually point out to an opposite results, showing that women will be more negatively affected from an automation increase. So do you have, maybe Julia, being a gender expert as well, or any of the other panelists, have an opinion on the gender dimension in this discussion?
Last year we finished a study for the Austrian Ministry of Economic, where we looked at gender dimensions as well. And what we see is that you have, if you divide total employment into tasks, you can see that you have gender differences between routine, non-routine tasks, manual and non-manual tasks. So if you are on the opinion that above all routine tasks will decline, routine tasks are often tasks of women. So that's for me, that's the challenge. But in the case of the manufacturing sector, we also did an analysis last year. What we see is, or what we found is that in the time span mid-1990s until 2016, we saw for the manufacturing sector that the only task which was increasing was the high-skilled tasks. So we saw that manual tasks as well as manual routine, manual non-routine tasks, these tasks were declining in the manufacturing sector. The only task that was increasing was this interactive non-routine. That's high-skilled tasks. At the other hand, for the service sector, we found that all kinds of tasks were increasing. The lowest increase has manual or routine task. But there was an increase in that case, but it was smaller than the decrease in the manufacturing sector, and overall we had a decrease. But what we see is that within the service sector, tasks were increasing. And for me, another point is in this discussion about employment gains. Industrial-related employment is focused in the service sector. It's not part of the manufacturing sector. So that's for me, that's crucial if you look at employment gains. On the one hand side, you have the manufacturing sector, and on the other, the service sector. And within the service sector, it's also included the industrial services. And in the case of Austria, industrial services were growing in the last years. I think it's since the last 2 years, quite strongly. So we had, on the one hand side, we had an increase in the manufacturing sector, as well as in such industrial services. So back to the first question, yes, there are gender differences in the task approach and in task structure of employment.
Thank you. Yeah, please, Lucas.
Yeah, I mean, I can, we have not fully analyzed this. In fact, we have a part on gender dimension. And I would like to confirm that while in all other areas we don't find much, except that women are better educated and increasingly better educated. But when it comes to the effect of ICT technology on employment, the only thing we find is exactly that as women are more represented in the more routine tasks, then there is a bias there. That's a clear bias. So I can only confirm that from our data. Thank you.
Anna, do you want to comment? Okay. So let me open the floor for questions. I see one over there. Maybe I collect 2 or 3. I see also some here. Please introduce yourself and try to be concise. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. Good morning, citizens. My name is Angelos Harlaftis, Epakos Advisors. We represent here the EcoX movement, a pan-European and Mediterranean movement which is based in direct democracy, in science and in ecology. We are occupied a lot of years with the robotics and the artificial intelligence. Georgios' studies is very good because we don't have a lot of studies. Doesn't matter the statistics. The data are very difficult, but I will begin with a word of Aristotle when he was accused that he was an oligarchic and he was with a slavery perspective of the Athenian democracy. He responded them that we will when the architect is going to speak to the automaton to execute the acts he needs, then it will stop any kind of slavery. So from this time, we had the robotics, which the robotics are very important, and we have a change of the society. This is the important thing. It's not a theme of unemployment or whatever, as you are seeing from the current system. This system has finished. We have to change. The question is, are we as Europeans are ready to lead as our movement proposes, or this is going to be done by the Far East? Because the Americans, they have the technology which is based from ours. And this is the mistake we are doing, and we have to refocus. For example, you are leaving for USA after some months, but the same thing is done to all the technological innovations we have here in Europe. Then they go to Boston, and all the robotics, they are there now. And in Canada, they leave Europe and they go there. Okay. This is a mistake. We have to refocus to China and to Far East. I have the last data from South Korea. I'm finishing. Are from 2007, when 10,000 teachers for English language or robots, they were made robots to teach the students because they didn't have enough teachers. Over there, they put the robots in the society already, and we don't have the data. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, there was a question here, and there, yes, please. Microphone.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Roca. I'm an economist for Microsoft. First of all, thanks a lot for this great study. It's so satisfying to see an academic work on this field, and it changed a bit from what we can see. My question, just one remark, talking about the ICT effect and how to measure the impact of AI. There is some data on Eurostat that measure the penetration of cloud computing and big data. It's only for 2016, but that could be a great use to as a proxy. And my question would be, would it be possible with your data set to actually adopt another perspective, drawing on Luca's comment, that low-wage countries like China would be actually competing with industries in Europe? Maybe we can also measure the mitigation effect that robots could have, helping European companies to stay competitive and thus staying on the market, then actually saving jobs by this competitiveness effect, and we'll be able to compete, so stay on the market. Thank you.
Thank you. From the back.
Thanks. Hello, Olirmas Brazis from FIPRA International. Thank you, Georgios, for the presentation, and to the other speakers, and I do agree with Lucas that indeed it's a very timely debate. I have two questions to Georgios. First is, why did you choose to focus on industrial robots with a rather narrow definition and exclude other forms of automation, such as simple vending machines or supermarket cashiers, or even artificial intelligence and algorithms? And another question would be, the data that we have is until 2007, if I'm correct, so this is a decade old. And in that time, the robots got both much cheaper and much more efficient. So I would presume that you would be qualified to at least discuss what would be the current impact on the more recent data, even if you don't have a study on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we start replying to these ones. Georgios, maybe you want to start.
So I think the first was more like a comment than a question. I think that the concern about machines and their impact is not new. It comes from many, many years ago, and Aristotle quote confirms that. I think that it is we should, as Europe, move forward by making the necessary changes. The problem is that we are still in the process of understanding the impact of new technologies in order to understand what these changes should be. And of course, it will be for individuals, they should pursue opportunities when they are given the opportunity to get new experiences in other places. On the second question, thanks for the remark about the data. We'll check it. I think that indeed, I mean, what we see in the data is that indeed we follow the Bloom, Draka and Varinen methodology to introduce the Chinese exposure to Chinese import. And indeed, we see that from the major economies around the world, it's the one that is likely to have the greatest impact for Europe. So I think, and this is also a response to Luca's comments, is that indeed going to that direction would be something interesting to do. What we need to be careful is how we will transform this in a specification that could be meaningful in the regional level in this approach. However, the impact of Chinese imports is there. It's considered. I used it in another project for to instrument competition, and I think that in this way we could also explore this low-income, high-income country, but also country with different digital policies, initiatives, which also there is not the low-income, high-income issue there, but it is also the perspective of targeting to particular digital domain and try to invest that. As the evidence show, China in their exposure to robots is increasing to large large extent. It's the highest growth rate that we have in any economy so far. So it's something that I don't have any answer right now, but I welcome this comment and I plan to work on that. Why industrial robots? Industrial robots, I think it's the first point I have to mention is it's an automated technology in the way it is defined, for which we have a lot of data. And we have data from early 90s, where, let's say, it is the beginning of automation, if with the exception of Japan probably, until now. So what we found is that it is very convenient to use this particular data set because it is very well, we have a lot of information in comparison to data on other machines. I'm not going to ICT capital because ICT capital can mean also other things. So I need to dig into that to see what part is the automation. But what we saw is that we have an example of automated technology which can estimate a particular impact on employment. We can do that in the local level. Since we had this well-established data set, already used studies, we were motivated to go to that direction. But I agree that it will be really interesting and important to extend this study to other automated technologies and to see what their impact will be. So it's something work in progress, let's say. And we are trying to investigate other well-defined automated technologies that could move to this direction. Impact after 2007. What we see is a constant increase without so many crisis effect on the adoption of robots. The first graph I saw showed that basically the European and the US approach is all very linear. So that is an interesting thing because that means even if we control for the crisis, the robotization of European industry increased. I would say that that could bring the productivity versus displacement effect into a new perspective. But it is something that also related to the development of other technologies. Of course, we have collaborative economy platforms that offer new forms of occupations, even if the terminology occupation for some people is problematic. Indeed, we would, I think, we are in the process of starting being more enterprising of how to use technologies for to supplement our income or for new forms of employment. So I think that that put the displacement productivity effect in a new perspective, and probably will it will be an interesting to see to what direction the total impact will go. Let me also mention here, going back to the job creation, that another empirically challenging exercise will be to isolate the productivity from the displacement effect and to see what is the magnitude of it. That will be probably a way to answer the job creation element you refer to. We didn't find so far a way to do that. We'll be thinking on that.
Okay, thanks. Do you want to comment or otherwise I give the floor? Yeah? Yes, please.
I don't want to comment, but I may wish to say a few words about policies going ahead.
Yes, that was my...
I don't know if it's the right time or...
It is, because we are all curious to know how to tackle robots.
And I will try to be short because I know that time is running. But I go back to my initial thought about what's the role of capital deepening, not capital deepening, etc. What I said in the beginning, which is the background to all this discussion. There, if we consider that capital and labor are complementary, and if therefore we see that higher education, higher training, stronger training is good for employment, so to create the positive effect that we were mentioning, the job creation effect. Therefore, I mean, policies are straightforward, I think. Policies like invest in training and education, first. Second, income support programs for those who are affected, and in cooperation with social partners to help this transition. Third, lifetime loans for retraining. This is also some strong argument towards constant retraining, let's say. And then last, supporting workers' adjustment in this changing world of work by investing in skills and maintaining and modernizing social protection systems. I say it very, very broadly. Obviously, in the Commission, we have a number of initiatives on that. We have the digital agenda, as you know, already, and a new communication on that with forthcoming. Also, the new skills agenda for Europe, for upskilling and reskilling. I will not go into details. And obviously the pillar of social rights, in which there are two main principles on access to labor and on equality.
Okay, thanks. That's a very important point. And I open again the floor, but maybe I also want to ask the audience, since there are many companies represented here, if you want to also state internal policies that I see representative from Siemens, Microsoft, Intel, Amazon present here today. So if you also have some lessons that you want to share. And, but I also saw a question there in the meantime.
Thank you. Thomas Jorgensen, European University Association. On your point on entrepreneurship and new technologies and displacement, what we see, but it's very anecdotal, what we see is that with particularly artificial intelligence, that startup model that is artificial intelligence plus something else, biotech, electrical engineering, could be anything, that the entry level of being an entrepreneur and starting your own company is lower, and there's a much larger field. And what we hear from our members, and again, it's completely anecdotal, is we have more students that instead of going and get a job, want to create their own company, their own startup. And that might have an effect at some place, maybe very small on displacement. But I think it was an interesting point.
Thank you. Yeah. And then you also want to intervene. Yes.
Hello, Ivar Kallio from the Conference of Finnish Industries. First, thanks to all the speakers, very interesting points. It was a while ago that I read a couple of blog posts from some economists. Unfortunately, can't remember who they were or whether they were referring to the US or the EU labour market. But the kind of idea was that there's surprisingly little displacement when you look at the labour markets by automation. And based on not on in-depth studies, but some numbers or ideas, the argument was that indeed the technology is still too expensive, which means that there are sectors where it's cheap enough, causing displacement on those sectors, but then you have spillover of labour to the other sectors, which of course when you have more labour supply, there's the same demand or maybe more demand, but then in effect it causes the wages to stagnate. And this sounds quite plausible, but I have a question to Georgios, whether is there anything supporting the idea or talking against it, or would this be something that you could take up in the later studies? Thank you.
Okay,
Since you ask a bit the view of companies like Microsoft and other, I can just express the view that we have internally on the topic, especially on AI, for example. Obviously, we also brand ourselves as an AI company, but the reality on the ground is that there is actually very, very few companies able to leverage AI, right? There are digital native companies that are born with this ecosystem, with data infrastructure, etc., that allows them to do that. But for the big majority of companies, they have not yet achieved digital transformation. So with no data infrastructure, no knowledge, etc., the impact on the labor market, we might see it in the coming 20 years. But trying to measure that right now, it is frankly very difficult. I'm trying to do that, but yeah, very, very few companies actually implemented AI right now.
Thank you. Last question there, I think, because then we need more time to reply.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be short as possible. First of all, thank you again for a very interesting event and paper. My name is Tomasz Mrozowski. I come from the Institute for Western Affairs in Poznań, in Poland. So I come with a bit of another perspective from a country with one of the lowest robot densities in the EU. But this is also the reason for my question. Because we have very low robot density, and we are at the beginning of the let's say, way to digitalization. But on the other hand, if I'm not mistaken, we also have one of fastest growing demands for robots compared to other EU states. So my question would be, if you see Central European countries and their, let's say, demand for robots and changes on their markets as a possible effect for your study. Maybe that's for discussion during lunch because I know it's a complicated topic, but just an idea. Maybe this could be like, you know, a next ambitious purpose for the whole EU economic policy of all the member states, not only the ones you chose for your study. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So maybe Georgios, you want to start, and then I will let the other panelists conclude as well with a remark.
Yes. First of all, on the comment in that side, I think, yeah, indeed, I take your comment on entrepreneurship. I think a colleague of mine has a paper on moving from startups to scale-ups, and there we see that there may be an issue when not creating startups, but moving startups to scale-ups, and that is an open question. How can incentivize more scale-ups, because that will have also implications for employment. There is a study, basically an ambitious study by Evans and Gower, which basically what they do is they go to each part of the world and they take notes of the statistics on digital platforms, which platforms are active, how much employment they give, and they find that while Europe, the number of platforms is not so great than in US or Asia, but the employment is much lower of people that are working in these platforms than in other parts of the world, and that, as a statistics, is interesting to follow. Now, talking about cost, demand issues, again, the data set that we have is we observe the introduction of the robots, so we cannot estimate how much the demand is. However, the trends are clear of lowering the price, increasing the quality, and it is not only, of course, the cost should be compared also with the production gains that we will have on the operation of robots. And clearly, so far, in manufacturing, that was the case. However, in the late years, we see that other industries catch up. There is a blog post that I have published which show that in the latest year, some other sectors have shown a growth, a tremendous growth in introducing robots in their production chain. And that also applies for Central European countries and Eastern European countries. If we see the statistics, we see that while the main countries of the sample for the time we explore here were the main participants of the markets, in the last 2-3 years, we have seen a very high increase on the number of robots introduced in these member states. So the robotization of the economy had the first phase, which were the big main industrial players that used such technologies for the production, but we see the trend of the other member states to follow with some delay and increase the robotization of their industry. So that is indeed something interesting, and it is related both to the demand, but also to the fact that robots now are affordable given the productive gains that you can have in order to introduce them.
Okay, thank you, Georgios. Julian?
No more.
No more?
Okay, on displacement, we don't see many layoffs because of industrial robots in general. When you look at data, there are no mass layoffs yet. That's one certainty that is there. This might also be due to the fact that precisely we still have machine-to-human interactions at a plant. So as long as that's there, there is, as you mentioned, there is need for retraining, there is need for investments, etc., and reorganization. But this is where we are right now, and maybe this is why we don't see that much of an employment effect here. Having said that, and that brings me back to the point that I made earlier, is that if you look at industrial robotics, that's probably the case. If you look at other digital technologies and their net effect on employment, that will potentially be higher and higher in the negative sense in a few years to come, this is where we have to look at as well. But your paper is about industrial robotics, so that's different. On startups, we also observed that they are obviously have an increase in employment at first, normal, but then after 5 years, there are several studies pointing out that if they precisely do not scale up, there is a drop or a stagnation in employment. So there are, in difference to SMEs, they're not creating that many jobs. And the same goes for many other digital companies that then don't have such a big employment footprint as such, which are important for us, again, when you look at employment numbers and employment quality. Also on the points that I made and that you responded to in Japan and Korea, I didn't mean to include data on them in your study, but just use such information as well as the information that is there on investments, for instance, in IoT, which is a complementary technology to industrial robotics, to use these data in the analysis to understand the landscape a bit better, not in the framework as such, because that I understand is A, not possible, B, is not necessarily useful if you look at Europe as such. Also to say that on productivity, and I think that's what you were referring to, it has to be precisely also seen separately as a factor, and then we have to look also at the financialization of economies, what that has to do with productivity in or decreases, and then also why it leads to less investment in training, stagnation in wages, and so on and so forth. And on policy solution, I think I've mentioned a couple of those earlier on, but just to say that in our opinion, also when you introduce industrial robots in sectors, what we need are European standards on validation and simulation systems, or at least some sort of discussion about that, which then might help also to increase the quality of production and compete precisely with China. And I think you're referring to reshoring as a potential effect. We don't see that yet, but that might also be due to just lower labor costs, lower standards in certain countries that make them still more competitive in this realm. So this is something worth considering. How do we ensure also quality of production through standards and validation systems and through investments precisely in infrastructure, green economy, other sectors that are on the rise, that are promising job creation, and therefore enabling then further along the line a transition to another job in another sector.
Okay, thank you. Lucas, a final remark if you want.
Yeah, just final remark to congratulate you for your excellent study. It's really very welcome, in particular that it is on our European countries, on our European cases and regions, etc. This is very good. And that looking ahead, we should focus on the policy implications, as I said, more investment, more quality training, etc.
Thank you. And speaking about policy response, I remind you that we will have a second session at 1 o'clock where we will discuss the impact of artificial intelligence on the economy and challenges and policy responses. So for sure we will continue the discussion there. Yes, I thank all the speakers for joining us today and you as well. So a round of applause for the speakers. And the lunch is, thank you, the lunch is served outside. We come back here at 1 o'clock. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, very good.